Well, first off, I want to give you a word of thanks, Nancy. I've been going through your content, and especially on YouTube, you put out a lot of good stuff.
Oh,
I
thank you
didn't
so much.
realize just recently learned that it took you, I think, 3 attempts to get into Meta. Is
Yes,
that right?
correct.
Okay, so that gives me a lot of confidence of, okay, a person of your stature can work and get into it. I'm kind of looking at exiting the startup world and looking at going back to one of the bigger companies. And Meta's been on my list for quite some time. And then looking at the careers page, it's a little bit daunting. So I reached out to Nancy, was very interested in kind of decoding some of the job descriptions that they had out there. Okay, so we got 8 openings across a variety of cities. So it's looking like, I was also looking at the total product manager positions that are open, and I chose the most generic ones, or the most generic one, just to kind of wrap my head around it. Like, what are we looking at base level, outside of very specific things like VR applications or identity? I saw another one up that alley, which are very, very specific. And looking at the top responsibilities, I'm wondering, given the current market for job seekers and the need to be very specialized in how you present yourself, being very specific in what you've worked with and the tools that you're pretty proficient in. When I look at that first bullet, plan, initiate, and manage information technology projects for web-based products and platforms, I could take that any number of ways. And I'm wondering, Nancy, what would your take? And we don't have to go line by line, but since it's the first one, it's probably good to kind of kick this discussion off. What I know about Meta is there's a lot of in-house products. I don't know the full tool suite, and I don't know the paradigm around product management. Are we lean product management? Are we more of an SVP type? There's so many different frameworks that come to mind.
What is a STB?
Silicon Valley Product Group, Marty Kagan.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. And what is lean?
Lean UX or lean product management. So thinking about, like, a rough shot MVP, doing the bare minimum to get the highest signal, not focusing on a full feature set, which is more common in kind of my most recent position coming from a startup of trying to iterate from 0 to 1, which is different than what I would imagine at Meta is more about optimizing existing products. So, and being able to relate to this, how would you tackle something like this? What would you think about the tools they use at Meta? How to connect that from tools that I've used in the past or folks on this call, and think about weaving that into a narrative?
So it's both lean and Silicon Valley Product Group. And I'll answer your question first on assumption that you'll be optimizing existing features. That's not the case for a lot of teams. What Facebook cares about is to give people a reason to go into Facebook. And in order for people to go into Facebook, you either get them to use existing features or give them a new reason to go into Facebook. And so there's a lot of teams that work on 0 to 1 type of products in Facebook. It's giving people a new use case to log into Facebook. An example of a 0 to 1 product would be when I was working on Facebook groups. I worked on a feature to highlight content from experts in the Facebook groups. So even though Facebook group has existed for years, it doesn't really do a good job highlighting content from experts because, one, we don't even know who the experts are. So just this quote unquote feature of highlighting content from experts, that is 0 to 1 because it does not exist.
How do I, if I were to go for a generic role like this and given that experience, right? How would I go about showing an example like what you just mentioned that could point a link to what I've done in the past, and either go for, okay, if not everything at Meta is optimizing an existing feature set, some of them at 0 to 1, is it foolish to be considering this job opening to begin with? Should I be looking at teams that are very specific that I can do more research on and see if there's a better fit based on my interest in what they're touting. Like if we went to an identity posting versus what they have here, it seems like you could go any number of ways here. And I don't know, based on your experience on the hiring team, I don't know what specifically they're looking at, whether we should be, or I should be biased more towards 0 to 1 or optimizing certain feature sets, or talking about my experience at Twitch, which is a little bit closer to, Meta's platform in terms of just scale and really culture.
What are you an expert in?
The PM's skill set that I cultivated at Bear Flag, and when I went through the transition, was really about voice of the customer. So synthesizing insights across customer groups of between 50 to 70 different farmers, and being able to prioritize the features that not necessarily folks were requesting, but the underlying pain point or job to be done. Use that framework there.
Mm-hmm. So you're more 0 to 1.
Yes.
If you're more 0 to 1, it fits this job description really well.
Right. So I could push back a little bit and look at other projects at Bear Flag too. So I inherited a technical architecture that basically offered telemetry and teleoperation. So for somebody to be able to send a command to a self-driving tractor and back, be able to read real-time stats, I inherited that. So part of what I did too, that I was pretty specialized in as well, was optimizing that existing feature set to actually simplify the gamut and get the core audience that we were shooting for right, because we were catering to too many different personas. And that was one of the challenges that I walked into as an engineer, and it got me really interested in getting closer to voice of the one. That would be more of an optimization one. So I guess, Nancy, if I were to anticipate your response here, is I could have a set of narratives that could point to optimization, and a set of narratives that point more from 0 to 1, and just feel out the interviewer, given that I can get to the stage, as to what they're looking for.
Yeah, I would put both on the resume. But by optimization, when you are operating at a scale like Facebook, optimization is like a lot of experimentation and a lot of A/B testing.
Right. Do you have a list of those core skill sets that you would say, here's what a meta profile looks great in? Like, we've covered experimentation. I've offered up voice of the customer, synthesizing insights, right? Is there a definitive list of like, here are the things we look for in a hiring panel, and you'll be graded across these different facets?
Yeah, so the easiest way to look at how the hiring panel evaluates people is by looking at the 3 different types of interviews that Meta conducts. One is product sense, second one is product execution, and third one is leadership and drive. And that's it.
And are those umbrella terms for things like experimentation, or maybe I should ask this question a different way. Those are unique to Meta, right? And if I'm translating maybe a more unorthodox PM background, that, just given the circumstances where I came from in a startup that didn't have a product organization, I was the first product manager for Bear Flag. I had to kind of write the rules and learn on my own, and not, be blessed with a great mentor like yourself at Meta or Roku, and be able to learn more ingrained frameworks that are industry best practices. Like, when I break down those 3 overall areas, and I know there's playbooks for this, but what are maybe some of the things, maybe buzzwords or key facets of the job that like stand out, and say, okay, within product sense, for example, what's going to make me really take that kind of unique background and answer the mail and say, this is why we need to hire this guy?
Yeah, in a product sense, the most important essence that we have to demonstrate is the ability to make good product decisions when there is no data. That's it. That's all we're demonstrating. So a lot of people are not comfortable when there is no data, but that is the point of the interview. What happens when you don't have data? Then how do you make your decisions? What are your decisions based on? And how do we know if these decisions are good product decisions? If it's in order for these decisions to be good, it has to make sense for the customer and it has to make sense for the company.
Right.
That's how you demonstrate good product sense. And in product execution, it's all about how do you enable your team to execute well? And how do you know if you're executing well? Well, you are measuring success. That's how you know whether you're executing well or not. So the execution interview is, how do you set goals for your team? And what goals would you set? And that's it. And then the second part of the execution interview is, now that you have your success criteria, how do you apply it when you have to make trade-off decisions, feature A versus feature B? What do you do? Well, you use the success criteria that you just defined to help you make those decisions. And that's what you have to demonstrate in the execution interview. And in a leadership and drive, it's literally evaluating your leadership and your drive. What does drive mean? It means resilience, means grit, means scrappiness, right? That's what drive means. Do you have that innate drive to do whatever it takes to help the team succeed? And are you a natural leader? How do you lead your teams when things are moving really fast and when a lot of people have different opinions? How do you get your team to converge, right? That's leadership. So that,
Got it.
so all of the points above are what the committee would be looking for.
Do you think, given the time that has elapsed since you were there last, and what like are those priorities in that framework, which I really appreciate the clarity that you're able to kind of like step through it. It shows a lot of experience. Has that changed at all in this job market? I mean, with the layoffs at Meta, has there been any, like, through your network, any sense of like, are we going to change the framework and really, because if there's a deluge of candidates, right, highly qualified guys coming and gals coming to Meta, I would assume that you guys are getting a little bit more specific with what you're looking for.
Correct. So the difference now, is when the market was good and when Meta was hiring a lot of people, they would hire everyone that passed the interview and put them in Bootcamp. So when these people join Facebook, they don't have a team defined. They just join this general pool and they spend weeks in Bootcamp until they find the right team. That was the previous model. The current model is, yes, you pass the interview and the hiring committee wants to also hire you, but there's a caveat. And the caveat is you have to find the team first. It's basically the Google model. You do the team matching first before you get the offer. So that's the difference. But the interview is the same.
How does that, the interview is the same, right? Mm-hmm. So the things you ask, the things you focus on, those are the same. But if you're switching the teams that you're flirting with or you're kind of dating with to kind of see if there's a fit, is there anything you can do in advance that you would recommend to get, like, do you have a sense of the top 5 teams where the probability is the highest that you might be faced with? Is there any way to get that insider knowledge?
Yeah, you want to get as much info from the recruiter as possible, which helps you prepare for these casual, quote unquote, casual dating conversations with hiring managers. It's exactly like going on a date.
Got it.
So how do you do well on a first date? Well, you show up at your best. You show interest in learning what they're about, right? You stop talking about yourself for a second, you listen, you really listen to what they need and what the problems they're trying to solve are. And then you respond by saying, here's how I can help you with these things.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
That makes a lot of sense. Going back to tool set, as you learn more about the teams that you're going through and you have this very well-defined 3 areas that you need to go deeper into, do you have any concern? Because I know if you're not looking at Meta, you're looking at any startup that's between Series A and maybe D and perhaps more. They're looking for folks that really know mode analytics, Tableau, Figma, right? These tools that are third party to Meta, and I'm sure there's in-house ones that are unique to Meta as well. Does that matter at all, in your opinion, to be well versed in?
No.
Okay. Why do you think it's different?
Different
in terms of not having a strong, because I'm looking at other startups outside of Meta, mm-hmm. or just startups in general, and refining my skill set around a couple of tools to be able to be very hyper focused and say, hey, for this tool like Figma, I can run through a lot of different frameworks and be able to prototype designs with design teams and understand that scene very well.
So at Meta,
yeah,
you would never prototype things in Figma. That's not your job.
Gotcha. So it's a totally different search, and this is where I'm getting caught up to speed, and yeah, it seems a little bit more isolated there.
You would be consuming Figma, but you wouldn't be creating Figma files. You have to know how to leave comments in Figma, but you're not creating prototypes.
Gotcha. I assume that the stronger example here would be maybe PRDs or the equivalent of at Meta.
Yes, the equivalent of PRDs at Meta. It's more of a strategy doc and the plan for the next 6 months.
Okay. Having examples of that, Nancy, would you recommend that being ready to go, or the equivalent of, like, if, for example, at Bear Flag, we never wrote PRDs. We took more of an Amazonian approach of working backwards and had a looser structure in how we thought about the future and went through prioritization. Is there a one-to-one pairing with understanding those core tools, right, of the PM, like a PRD, and maybe more strategy docs that there's like an exhaustive list of what you would be expected to say, hey, I know I can speak your language. I know I can work in this paradigm, because it's different across each company, right? If you go to Amazon, it's a totally different paradigm. Is there a list of those things that stand out to you?
The biggest difference in an environment like Meta is, first, you have to understand how they measure good performance and what type of behavior is incentivized and seen as good work at a company like Meta. So in a cross-functional environment, which is called out in the first line of this job description, work with cross-functional teams of engineers, designers, DS, researchers, design, etc. Every single one of these functions are incentivized to contribute to the product roadmap and product strategy. If your idea is accepted in the roadmap and in the strategy, then you get bonus points. That is how people are incentivized. Because the system is laid out that way, that means every single function would have a lot to say in what the strategy should be and what the roadmap should be. This type of behavior is not super common in a lot of the other companies. So what does that mean to the PM at an environment like Meta? It means your voice is one of many. People are not looking to the PM to come up with the strategy or to come up with a roadmap. Everyone wants to come up with strategy. Everyone wants to come up with a roadmap. So here, the biggest shift is, as a Meta PM, your job is to drive consensus. Your job is to convince everyone why this strategy is the strategy. Now, this is the biggest shift.
This brings to mind a distinction that you might agree to. I'm not quite sure, but there's two archetypes of a PM. From what I can gather, you're either a facilitator or you're an owner, right? So you can, and I think what you're saying is that the best PMs at Meta, they're not really driving a strong vision and setting it. They're more of a facilitator, and you want to lean into that.
No, that's also not true.
Okay.
If you're seen as a facilitator, then the team can go on without you. Anyone can be the facilitator. So what you have to do here is you have to be the owner, but when there's so many opinions on the table, how do you get the team to move fast and still bring them along? That's the hardest part.
And I'm going to probably regret asking this next question, but how would you do that, Nancy? Is it context dependent? Does it depend on the project that you're at? But like, what's a great example of a PM that's able to solve that problem?
So the tactic here is you want to define your principles up front.
And just for clarification, what's a principle? Sorry.
Principle is also used at companies like Amazon. Principle is it's a framework to help people make decisions faster. So for example, one of the principles I had, not at Facebook, when I was at Roku, was we will always prioritize user sentiment over ads revenue. A principle is not necessarily right or wrong. A principle is just, this is what we value, because our strategy is we're going to optimize for user sentiment because it's going to drive long-term brand loyalty. And that's what our team is here to do. Now, with that principle in place, you can argue it both ways, right? We could choose to optimize for ads revenue, which also benefits the company. But we chose to optimize for user sentiment. And so when there's a lot of opinions, we always go back to the principle. Look, our principle is this. Therefore, let's not spin our wheels on these other things that don't align with our principle. And so it works really well when you have a handful of principles that are not necessarily right or wrong. It's just the way we have decided to anchor our values in and then apply those principles to help the team make decisions fast. Because the other element of being successful at Meta is you have to move fast. It's easy when no one has a lot of opinions and PM just says, let's do this, and people just follow. Then moving fast is not really a big problem. But in an environment when everyone has a say, because everyone wants to get a good performance review, you're bound to slow down because you also cannot leave people behind.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Question, just going back to the owner facilitator distinction. At the end of the day, I would assume that arriving at that principle is part of, like, if I walked into day one at Meta as a PM and there's already this bias that you're mentioning that's been thought out that we should go through, bias towards user sentiment over ads revenue. Excuse me. At what point as an owner, if I came in and I was like, well, is that the right call? And if I'm an owner saying, okay, I'm not going to merely facilitate what's already been decided before me, I want to bring some like fresh eyes to the problem. I'm assuming there would be case studies that you would bring up of matching that paradigm of saying, hey, these were the underlying primitives that we decided on. As a PM, I see myself as somebody that can really not just see what everybody thinks the principle should be, but actually make that call for the team, given, because you don't want to design by committee, right? That would be purely facilitating. At some point, you have to put your foot down, but you want to use it in an organic way that resonates with the crowd.
Right.
And maybe draw that out as an example. Is that an example in your mind of being an owner of like, okay, at some point you need to like hold people to a commitment and kind of drive that forward?
There is a step 0. Step 0 is first you assess and you understand why these principles were put there in the first place.
Right.
There has to be a reason why. Right? So before you go and try to change things, which by the way, you will make enemies. Right? You can't do that when you're super new. You have to understand context. And a good way to revisit the principles is times have changed, market shifted, let's revisit. Right? There has to be a reason why you're revisiting decisions that were made in the past. That's how you bring people along.
That connects me, and I'm wondering if that's a in this climate, I think that skill set of being able to tactfully challenge maybe the framework that is institutionalized at Meta, not attack it, but like buffer it, offer it, bolster it, usher in a new age, which is part of my interest, if that's not coming across too, obviously, of coming in and asking those tough questions. I would assume that when we're saying we are looking for extremely entrepreneurial and product managers to come in, one of the questions I had in just looking at this posting is, what do they mean? How do they see entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship within Meta?
Yeah.
And how does that relate to being an owner facilitator, not stepping on anybody's toes, but really trying to push the thinking to maybe something new or different?
Yeah. So, and what do entrepreneurs do? They're really scrappy. They do things that might not be in their job description, but they do it anyway, right? Or they try to get funding because they really believe in this, in their cause. So those are the traits that Meta wants to see in their PMs. So let's say there's a deadline and you can't meet the deadline. If you're not entrepreneurial, you might ask for more people, or you might cut scope, right? But if you were entrepreneurial, you would try to solve the issue in other ways. For example, you could partner with another team. Or another example is you could see if there's any reusable things that you could just take and reuse and repurpose. Or you could beg another team to come and help you. And it might not be another engineering team. It could be like a operations team if the problem can be solved operationally. Right, so that's how an entrepreneurial PM would operate versus a non-entrepreneurial PM.
I'm glad you made that point, because when I look back, and maybe I went through to the weeds too quickly and talking about Figma, but really looking at the skill set around Figma, that quality that you're talking about that's core to being an entrepreneur is about doing UX, maybe, if the situation demands for it, right? It's about doing monetization with maybe BDs, right? If that's what it's called for. Well,
correct. Yes.
That's kind of front and center.
Yes.
So if I'm going into the interview, and again, we have these 3 general areas that I'm walking in through, wouldn't that mean that I would be best to be able to show that entrepreneurial mindset of saying, hey, look, I'm not just going to write a PRD. I'm going to hustle. I'm going to find the right influencers. I'm going to do what it takes to get the job
Right.
done.
Right.
And here's a set of skills that I've accrued over time that at least demonstrates that I'm able
Correct.
to do that.
Yes.
But isn't necessarily the tool set that you guys use and you guys want to run with, i.e. Figma in particular, right?
Yeah, that's the spirit. It's not about showing that you know how to use Figma, right? That's tactical.
Yeah.
Right. The spirit is you do whatever it takes to help the team succeed.
That makes a lot of sense. That resonates a lot.
I'm gonna answer some of the questions that came in. And
Sorry,
we didn't get into the behavioral questions. But hopefully what we just talked about here, you could also apply to behavioral questions. There's a lot of commonality there. Are there universal principles followed in Meta? Yes and no. It's not necessarily published like the Amazon set of principles, but what are very well known would be move fast, but don't break things, or don't mistake motion with progress, right? And the other one that's pretty popular is what would you do if you're not afraid?
And so can you please repeat that, the principles that is not codified but something that is followed at Meta? You said two, like don't confuse motion with, I was just noting down, but I lost track.
Yeah, don't confuse motion with progress.
Okay.
The other one is what would you do if you're not afraid? Oh, there's another one. Feedback is a gift. What was the first one I said? Move fast, but don't break things.
Awesome.
Just curious, Nancy, do you know why they changed that to not break things?
Because
that phrase?
Yeah. They got too big. You can't like bring down Facebook, or people would call 911.
Got it. Makes sense.
Yeah. Hopefully that was helpful. I will see you all next time. Bye.